The pocket watch landed in Louisa Reed's palm like a confession she had never asked to hear. It was warm from his body heat, and that warmth was the cruelest part of it, because it meant he had been holding it close right up until the moment he pressed it into her hand, right up until the moment he turned and walked away from her without looking back, his boots raising small clouds of red dust on the street of Caldwell, Kansas, and the late afternoon sun throwing his shadow long and thin behind him like a wound in the earth. She stood frozen on the boardwalk outside the general store with the watch in her fist and her throat too tight to form words, watching the broad set of his shoulders diminish as he walked toward the Marshal's office at the far end of 2nd Street. She wanted to call after him. She wanted to shout his name, Phineas Abbott, and make him turn around and explain himself, explain why he was giving her the only personal object she had ever seen him carry, explain what he meant by those 7 words he had spoken in that quiet, controlled voice that had cost him more than he let on. Come find me when you are ready to talk. Talk about what? About the letter she had found. About the name she had seen written in his private records, the name that had tilted the ground beneath her feet and sent everything she thought she understood about this man spinning away from her. About the dark past he had never once volunteered, the secrets he had kept so carefully that she had walked alongside him for 3 months without suspecting a single one of them, believing she was coming to know a man, when in truth she had only been coming to know the version of himself he was willing to show her. Or perhaps he wanted her to come talk to him about the fact that she had feelings for him that terrified her, feelings she had never spoken aloud because the courage required to say them had always seemed like more than she possessed. The watch ticked steadily against her palm. She looked down at it. The case was silver, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling, and when she pressed the small release latch with her thumbnail, the cover sprang open to reveal a face marked in Roman numerals, the hands telling her it was 10 minutes past 4 on a Thursday afternoon in October of 1878. Engraved on the inside of the case in handwriting that was not Phineas Abbott's were the words, "For the one who carries the weight of what is right." She snapped it shut. She pressed her free hand flat against her sternum because her heart was doing something irregular and painful beneath it. And then she did what she had been doing since she arrived in Caldwell 6 months ago, running from a betrayal so complete that it had taken everything she owned and left her with nothing but a carpet bag, a set of skills she had never expected to need, and a name she was no longer certain she trusted. She tucked the watch into the pocket of her skirt, lifted her chin, and walked back into the general store to finish her work. But the weight of it rode with her through every remaining hour of that day, and it would not leave her alone. Louisa Reed had come to Caldwell in the spring of 1878, arriving on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway on a Tuesday morning when the cattle town was already humming with the sounds of a place that never fully slept. She was 26 years old. She had 43 cents to her name, and she had left behind in St. Louis a life she could no longer bear to look at. The life she had left behind included a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had been her employer at the accounting firm where she had worked for 4 years, and who she had believed was her future. Gerald Whitmore had presented himself as a respectable businessman, a man of standing and dependability, and she had trusted him entirely, because she had been raised to believe that trust given carefully was trust well placed. What she discovered, 2 weeks before she boarded the train west, was that Gerald Whitmore had been using the firm's accounts to funnel money to interests she could not name without her throat closing with shame and anger. And when the firm's books were examined by a federal auditor, it was Louisa Reed's signature, placed there at Gerald's instruction on documents she had not been permitted to scrutinize, that appeared beneath every fraudulent transaction. She had not known. She had not known, and she could not prove she had not known, and Gerald Whitmore had looked her in the eye in his mahogany-paneled office and told her that if she said one word about his involvement he would make certain she was prosecuted to the fullest extent the law allowed, and that he had friends in very high places who would ensure her guilt was unquestionable. She had believed him about the friends in high places. She had seen the evidence of them often enough. So she had run. It was not a noble choice. She knew that. She had carried the weight of that knowledge every single day since, the gnawing awareness that she had allowed injustice to proceed unchecked because she was afraid, and the equally gnawing awareness that had she stayed, she would have been destroyed by a system that was not constructed to protect women like her, women without money or influence or a powerful man standing beside them. Caldwell had been a random choice, a name she had seen on a railway map, a town far enough west that the long arm of Gerald Whitmore's influence seemed unlikely to reach it. She had arrived with no plan and no connections, and within 3 days of her arrival she had secured a position as the bookkeeper and assistant to Clarence Webb, who owned Webb's General Merchandise on 2nd Street, and who had needed someone numerate enough to stop his inventory from hemorrhaging profit in directions he couldn't account for. She was good at her work. She had always been good at her work. And she had kept her head down and her eyes forward and slowly, carefully, begun the painstaking process of building something from nothing. Phineas Abbott she had encountered for the first time on her 4th day in Caldwell. She had been crossing the street when a horse came around the corner of the livery at a speed that made the animal a hazard, ridden by a young cowhand who was demonstrating more enthusiasm than skill, and she had frozen in the middle of the street because her legs simply stopped cooperating with her intention to move. What saved her from being struck was a hand that closed around her arm and pulled her sideways with a force that was controlled rather than rough, and she found herself standing on the boardwalk with her heart in her throat, looking up at a man who was already releasing her arm and stepping back to give her space. He was tall. Not extravagantly so, but enough that she had to tilt her head up slightly to see his face beneath the brim of his hat. He had dark eyes, a strong jaw with a day or two of dark stubble along it, and the particular quality of stillness that she would later come to understand was simply the way Phineas Abbott occupied the world, as though he had made a private decision not to waste motion or words on anything that did not require them. On his chest was pinned the silver star of the Marshal's office. "Are you hurt?" he asked, just those 3 words, and then he waited. "No," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, assessing eyes that were not unkind, just careful, and then he turned and crossed the street toward the errant cowhand, who was already swinging down from his horse with the look of a young man who knew he was about to have a conversation he had been hoping to avoid. That was how it began. Not with drama, not with a declaration. Just a hand on her arm and 3 words and then a nod, and the world rearranging itself in some small way that she would not fully recognize until much later. She saw him regularly after that, because Caldwell was not a large town, and because the general store sat near enough to the Marshal's office that their paths crossed as a matter of geography. He would come in for supplies sometimes, coffee and dried beans, and occasionally a newspaper if one had arrived on the train. He was polite to Clarence Webb and straightforward in his transactions. He was not a man who wasted time on small talk. The first time he spoke to her at length was in the 2nd week of June, when a dispute between 2 cattle ranchers had spilled over into the store, and she had been the only person present when it escalated from words to the prospect of something worse. She had handled it the way she handled most things, which was to speak plainly and directly, and without any show of the fear she was feeling. And by the time Phineas Abbott arrived, having been alerted by a boy running down the street, the 2 men were sitting at opposite ends of the store's front counter with cups of coffee that she had poured from the pot Clarence always kept warm, and the immediate danger had passed. He had looked at the 2 men, looked at her, looked at the coffee cups, and something in his expression had shifted very slightly. "Miss Reed," he said, "a word." He asked her outside in the afternoon heat of the boardwalk what she had said to them. She told him. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "That was well done," and she could tell from the way he said it that he did not offer that assessment carelessly. After that, they talked more. Not every day and not always for long, but he would stop sometimes when he was passing and exchange a few words with her, and she came to understand that for Phineas Abbott, this was a significant offering. She came to look forward to it in a way that she told herself was simply the pleasure of speaking with someone intelligent, someone who listened when she spoke and responded with substance rather than performance. She learned things about him piecemeal, the way you learn things about a private person, through what they say around the edges of what they won't say directly. She learned that he had been Marshal of Caldwell for 2 years, that he had come from Texas before that he ate his evening meals at the Drover's Rest boarding house on Main Street, and that he had no family in the territory that anyone seemed to know about. He did not drink. He attended church on the occasional Sunday, but did not wear his attendance as a declaration of virtue. He was fair in his application of the law and firm in it, and the people of Caldwell seemed to regard him with a respect that was grounded in watching him do his job well rather than in any personal warmth. Not that he was cold. She did not believe he was cold. She believed he was guarded, and that those two things were not the same, and she believed it because she recognized the difference from the inside. She told him nothing of substance about herself for the first month. He did not ask. This, she realized over time, was one of the things she trusted about him, this quality of not pressing, of letting her exist in his vicinity without demanding that she explain herself. Caldwell was the kind of place that asked few questions of newcomers, partly because many newcomers had good reasons for their distance from their pasts, and Phineas Abbott seemed to understand this on a level that went beyond professional tolerance. In July, she told him about St. Louis. Not all of it. She told him she had worked as a bookkeeper, that she had left under circumstances that had not been of her choosing, that she was in the process of deciding what came next. She watched his face while she spoke. He gave nothing away, but he also gave no indication of the judgment she had braced for, no flicker of the conclusion she feared, which was that a woman who had left a good position in a city was either foolish or damaged or both. "Do you intend to stay?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "There's useful work here for someone who can manage numbers," he said. It was not a declaration, not an invitation, just a statement of fact. But she turned it over in her mind afterward and found it warming. August brought a heat that settled over Caldwell like a physical thing, heavy and relentless, and with it came the last of the season's cattle drives, herds coming up from Texas along the Kishom Trail with their attendant cowhands, and the business that followed the cowhands into town. Caldwell was a wild place during cattle drive season, loud and chaotic and prone to the kinds of conflicts that tested the limits of one marshal and his 2 deputies. She watched Phineas Abbott manage it with a methodical competence that she found herself studying, the way he could walk into a room where violence was brewing and change the temperature of it with nothing but his presence and his voice. She also noticed that he never seemed to go anywhere that wasn't the job. He was either at the marshal's office, or on the street, or at the boarding house. He did not participate in the social life of the town, did not attend the dances at the Grange Hall or the suppers organized by the church ladies or the informal gatherings that constituted Caldwell's attempt at community. She had wondered about this. She had wondered whether it was preference or something else, whether the solitude he seemed to carry with him everywhere was chosen or imposed. She found out in September, and not the way she had expected. The weather had turned by then, the grinding heat replaced by the first cool breath of autumn, and the cattle drive season had wound down, and Caldwell had settled back into something approaching the rhythms of an ordinary small town. She was in the back of the store one afternoon doing the weekly inventory when she heard the front door open and the particular sound of a man who was not there to shop. She came out to find Phineas Abbott standing at the counter with his hat in his hand, and an expression on his face that she had not seen before, something contained and deliberate, the look of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say and is nevertheless finding the execution more difficult than anticipated. "Miss Reed," he said, "I would like to ask whether you might be willing to take supper with me this Friday evening at the Drover's Rest, if you have no prior engagement." She looked at him for a moment. He held her gaze steadily without the performance of ease. "I would like that," she said. "Thank you, Marshal." Something in his face settled, not relaxed exactly, but settled like a thing that had been uncertain achieving a footing it trusted. 7 o'clock, if that suits." "It suits." He nodded, put his hat back on, and left. She stood behind the counter for a full minute after the door closed, and then she turned and went back to the inventory with a heart that was behaving in a manner she was choosing not to examine too closely. The supper was not what she expected, which was to say it was better. She had expected formality and carefully maintained distance, the kind of polite interaction that served as a social placeholder, without revealing anything meaningful about either party. Instead, she found that Phineas Abbott, in the context of a table and food and 2 hours with nowhere particular to be, was a different calibration of himself. He was still quiet, still considered in what he said, but there was a quality of attention he gave her that she felt as something almost physical, the sense that when she spoke she had his entire focus, that there was nothing behind his eyes calculating its own response while she was still forming hers. They talked about books, which surprised her. He read seriously, not widely, but seriously, and he had opinions about what he had read that were his own rather than borrowed from what other people had said about them. They talked about Kansas, about the particular character of the Flint Hills country around Caldwell, and how different it was from places she had lived before. They talked carefully around the things they were not yet ready to say directly to each other, and she found that even the careful navigation of those silences was more honest than most conversations she had known. Walking back from the Drover's Rest in the cool October air, he walked beside her on her right, between her and the street, which she recognized as a deliberate positioning. When they reached the door of the boarding house where she rented a room, he stopped and turned to face her, and for a moment the night was very quiet around them. "I enjoyed this evening," he said. "So did I," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the yellow light coming through the window behind her, and she saw something move through those dark eyes, some private weighing of something, and then he said, "Good night, Miss Reed," and turned and walked back down the street. She stood in the doorway watching him go and tried to understand the feeling in her chest, which was part warmth and part an ache she could not name, and which she suspected was the beginning of something she was not prepared to be beginning. They had supper again the following Friday, and the Friday after that. The conversations deepened. They moved from the easier things to the less easy ones, from books and the character of the territory to the question of what they each believed about justice, about the law, about the responsibilities of a person who had the ability to see when things were wrong. This last topic was a charged one for her, and she knew it showed in the way she spoke about it, the compressed energy in her voice that she could never quite prevent when the question of what a person owed the truth came up. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "You sound as though this is not entirely theoretical," he said one evening. Not pushing, just observing, and she looked at him across the table, and for a moment was absolutely certain she was going to tell him everything, the whole story, Gerald Whitmore and the fraudulent accounts, and the documents with her signature and the threat and the running. The certainty was almost physical, a pressure in her chest moving upward toward her throat. And then she heard Gerald Whitmore's voice in her memory saying that he had friends in high places, and she thought about the fact that Phineas Abbott was the law, that the Marshal's office was connected to the federal apparatus that had sent the auditor to St. Louis in the first place, and the certainty retreated back down and settled cold and heavy in her stomach. "Some of it," she said. And then, because the partial truth felt worse than silence, she said, "I'm not ready to tell you all of it yet." He looked at her steadily. "All right," he said, "just that." No pressure, no visible disappointment, just an acceptance that felt like respect. It was this, she would think later, that began to really undo her. Not his presence or his attention or the particular quality of his dark eyes in the lamplight, though all of those things were operative. It was the respect. It was the way he looked at her as though she were a person capable of knowing her own mind and deserving of the space to use it. The letter was something she found by accident. She had been at the Marshal's office delivering a ledger of civic accounts that the town council paid her to keep, a small additional income that she had negotiated for herself in September. Phineas Abbott was not in the office when she arrived, having been called out to deal with a situation at one of the ranches east of town, and his deputy, a young man named Orville Prout, who had not yet learned that lending people access to things was a way of creating problems, had let her in to leave the ledger on the desk. She had not looked at anything that was not her business. She had placed the ledger on the desk and turned to leave. But the name on the open document that lay beside the inkwell stopped her before she reached the door, stopped her as surely as if she had walked into a wall. The name was Gerald Whitmore. She stood very still for a moment. She looked at the door, and then at the document, and then at the door again. Then she turned and crossed back to the desk and read the document. It was a federal communication, bearing the seal of the Department of Justice in Washington, and it was addressed to Marshal Phineas Abbott of Caldwell, Kansas. It informed the Marshal that the investigation into the financial activities of Gerald Whitmore of St. Louis, Missouri, was ongoing, and that information received through the federal auditor's office suggested that a person of interest in the case, one Louisa Reed, formerly employed by Whitmore's accounting firm, had been traced to the vicinity of Caldwell. The communication requested that the Marshal ascertain whether Miss Reed was indeed residing in his jurisdiction, and if so, to notify the federal office so that arrangements could be made for her to be interviewed as a witness. A witness, not a suspect, a witness. She read the word 3 times. She read the whole document twice more, slowly and carefully, and she understood its content precisely. The Department of Justice was not looking to prosecute her. They were looking to build a case against Gerald Whitmore, and they believed she had information that could help them do so. They had connected her to Caldwell, and they had written to the local marshal asking him to find her. And the local marshal knew her. He had known her for months. He had taken supper with her 3 times and looked at her with those dark, careful eyes, and he had not said one word. She placed the document back exactly as she had found it, angled the same way against the inkwell, and she walked out of the marshal's office and back to the general store, and worked for 3 hours with the focused mechanical efficiency of someone who is keeping a very large internal storm contained by the application of rigid external structure. She was not irrational in her reaction. She understood, when she sat with it that evening in her rented room, that there were multiple explanations for why he hadn't told her. He might have been waiting for the right moment. He might have been uncertain how to approach it. He might have made a professional judgment that disclosing an active federal communication to its subject was inadvisable. But she also could not unknow the sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet, the terrible familiar feeling of discovering that a person she had trusted had a hidden purpose she had not known about, a connection to her past that he had not disclosed. She knew the shape of betrayal now, had learned it from Gerald Whitmore, and even though she understood intellectually that this situation was not the same, understanding it intellectually and feeling the safety she had been building over months remain intact were 2 entirely different things. She had gone to speak to him the following morning. She had walked to the marshal's office with every intention of being reasonable, of asking him directly to explain, of giving him the opportunity that Gerald Whitmore had never given her. But when she arrived, he was in the middle of a confrontation with 2 men who had come into town on horses that bore brands they couldn't account for, and she had stood in the office doorway waiting for several minutes before she understood that now was not the moment, and turned and left. It had been that afternoon, when she was coming out of the general store with a parcel of supplies, that he appeared. He must have come looking for her. He came around the corner from the direction of the marshal's office, walking with his usual deliberate pace. And when he saw her, he stopped, and she stopped, and they stood on the boardwalk in the October afternoon, with 12 feet of space between them and the air very clear around them, with the particular sharpness of autumn on the Kansas plains. She could see from the way he looked at her that he knew she had seen the document. She did not know how he knew, but he did, and he was not a man who tried to manage information by pretending it wasn't there. "Louisa," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the title in front of it, and it landed in her chest with a weight that was entirely out of proportion to its syllables. She didn't speak. She looked at him, and she could feel all the things she needed to say pressing up inside her like water against a dam, and none of them were able to get past the tightness in her throat. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat. He produced the silver pocket watch and he held it toward her, and when she didn't move, he crossed the distance between them and placed it in her hand, and folded her fingers around it with a care that was almost unbearable. "Come find me when you are ready to talk," he said, and he walked away. She stood on the boardwalk for a long time after he was gone. She went back into the store. She worked until closing. She ate supper alone at the boarding house and said very little to the other residents. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and opened the watch and read the engraving again. For the one who carries the weight of what is right. The watch ticked against the silence of the room. She thought about the federal document and its single crucial word, witness, not suspect, witness. She thought about the way he had said her name. She thought about 3 months of Friday evenings and dark eyes that listened and the quality of attention that she had not encountered anywhere before. And she thought about the fact that she had spent 6 months being afraid, and that fear had cost her almost everything it was possible to lose before the age of 30, and that she was tired to the bottom of herself, of letting it run her. She put the watch in her pocket. She picked up her shawl from the hook on the door. She went downstairs and out into the night. 2nd Street was quiet, the last of the afternoon's activity long since dispersed. The marshal's office had a light in the window, a steady yellow glow that she could see from half a block away. She walked toward it. She pushed the door open. He was at his desk. He looked up when she entered, and she watched him take in the fact of her being there, and she saw something in his face that she could only describe as a kind of relief, as though he had been holding his breath and had now been permitted to release it. She sat down in the chair across the desk from him, the one that was usually occupied by people who were either there to make complaints or there to answer questions, and she put both hands flat on her knees and she said, "Tell me everything." He told her everything. His voice was quiet and even, and he didn't look away from her face while he spoke, and what he told her was this: that the federal communication had arrived in September, that he had recognized her name immediately because she had introduced herself to Clarence Webb in his presence on her first week in town, and that he had faced a genuine professional dilemma about how to proceed. He had not gone to the federal office immediately as the communication had requested. He had waited because something about the framing of the communication troubled him. He had dealt with enough federal paperwork to recognize when a document was written with an agenda behind its neutral language, and the communication had been clear enough that it wanted information on Louisa Reed's whereabouts, but it had not been forthcoming about the full nature of the case or the basis for its claims. He had made inquiries of his own. He had written to a former colleague in the federal marshal's service in Missouri who he trusted absolutely, asking for an honest account of what the Whitmore case actually looked like from the inside. The response he had received 2 weeks ago had confirmed what he had begun to suspect. Gerald Whitmore was under serious federal investigation for financial fraud and conspiracy. Louisa Reed was categorically not a suspect. The auditor's report had been clear that the documents bearing her signature showed patterns of manipulation by a person with access to her credentials, and that the timing and character of the transactions indicated she had been used rather than involved. The request to locate her was legitimately for the purpose of obtaining her testimony as a witness against Whitmore, who was, as of the most recent information, working very hard to prevent exactly that testimony from being obtained by claiming she had fled because she was guilty. He had been trying to decide how to tell her when she had clearly found the document herself and drawn her own conclusions from it. When he finished, the room was very quiet. She could hear the tick of a clock on the wall and the distant sound of something down the street, and inside all of that the tight, complicated noise of everything inside her rearranging itself. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she asked. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "Because when I began to understand what had been done to you," he said, "I needed to be certain of what I was going to say before I said it. You had been given cause by people in positions of authority to believe that the law was something to be afraid of. I did not want to walk up to you with a federal document in my hand and present you with a crisis before I had anything useful to offer alongside it." She stared at him. "You were protecting me from it. I was trying to ensure that when you learned about it, you learned about it with the full picture rather than half of it," he said. "That is perhaps not the same as protecting you. You are more than capable of handling difficult information, but I wanted to be of use when I told you, not just to be the person who delivered the problem." She sat with that for a long moment. "You should have told me sooner," she said. "Even if you didn't have all the answers yet, I had a right to know." "Yes," he said. "You're right, I'm sorry." No defense, no qualification. Just yes, and you're right, and I'm sorry, delivered in the same quiet voice he used for everything, and it hit her somewhere deep and tender where she was not expecting it. She reached into her pocket and placed the pocket watch on the desk between them. He looked at it and then up at her. "The engraving," she said. "Who wrote it?" Something moved across his face. He picked up the watch and held it in his hand for a moment. "My father," he said. "He gave it to me when I took my first appointment in Texas. He said that the law could be used to protect the powerful or to protect what was right, and that the two things were not always the same, and that a man who could not tell the difference between them had no business carrying a badge." She looked at him. "Where is your father now?" "He died in 1874, he said. "Fever." The plain simplicity of the grief in that statement was one of the things she would always remember about this night. The way he delivered it without self-consciousness and without reaching for performance to make it seem less. "I'm sorry," she said. "So am I," he said. He turned the watch in his hand once, then placed it back on the desk and pushed it toward her. "I want you to keep it." She looked at the watch and then at him. "Why?" "Because you carry the weight of what is right," he said. "You left everything rather than put your name to what you knew was wrong, even when you were given every reason to stay and be comfortable. That is not a small thing." She was quiet for a long time. "I ran," she said. "I didn't stay and fight." "You survived," he said. "Those are sometimes the same thing, and now there is an opportunity to do the fighting if you want to." She understood what he meant. He meant the testimony. He meant Gerald Whitmore and the Department of Justice and the case that was being built. He meant the possibility of going on the record with what she knew. "If I testify," she said, "and if he has the protection he claims to have, I could still be prosecuted." "I will not allow that to happen," he said. She raised her eyes to his face. He said it without drama, without the grandiosity of a promise being inflated beyond what a person could guarantee. He said it with the grounded certainty of a man who had made a decision and intended to stand by it. "You can't promise me that," she said. "I can promise you that I will use every legal resource available to me to prevent it," he said. "And I can promise you that you will not face it alone." She looked at him across the desk in the lamplight and felt something in her chest give way, not break exactly, but open like a door she had kept shut for long enough that she had nearly forgotten there was a room beyond it. "Phineas," she said. His given name for the first time the way he had used hers that afternoon. Something shifted in his face. "I have been afraid," she said, "for a very long time. I am not certain I know how to be otherwise at this point." "I know," he said. "I am also not certain," she said, and here her voice did something she hadn't planned. It softened. It went somewhere more honest than she had intended to let it go. that I have ever met anyone who made being less afraid seem like something I could actually manage. He was very still. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that was open in a way he typically wasn't, something that cost him. She could see it costing him, the way voluntary vulnerability costs the people who are unaccustomed to it. "Louisa," he said. "I know," she said. "I am not ready, but I wanted you to know that." He nodded once. He looked down at the watch on the desk between them. "Then we will wait," he said. "There is no urgency on my side, only on the matter of the federal case, and that can be managed at whatever pace you need." "And the other matter," she said. He looked at her. "The other matter can wait as long as it needs to," he said. "I am not going anywhere." She picked up the watch. She stood from the chair. He stood with her, which was a courtesy she had come to expect from him, and which she found she was quietly grateful for every time. "Good night, Phineas," she said. "Good night, Louisa," he said. She walked out of the Marshal's office and back to her boarding house in the cool October night, and the watch ticked in her pocket all the way there, and she thought that perhaps the room beyond the door was not as dark as she had feared. The weeks that followed were a careful negotiation between the professional urgency of the case and the slower, more complicated territory they were navigating between them personally. She wrote a formal statement for the federal office in the first week of November, working with Phineas in the Marshal's office over several evenings to document everything she knew about Gerald Whitmore's activities, the transactions she had processed, the documents she had signed, the instructions she had received, and the threat he had made when she discovered what was happening. Phineas reviewed every word of the statement before it left Caldwell, and he sent it accompanied by his own addendum to his contact in Missouri, laying out the evidence for her status as a witness and his professional assessment of the case against Whitmore. Working alongside him in those evenings, she came to know him in a new way, watching how his mind operated on a problem, the methodical patience with which he built an argument, the precision of his language when precision mattered. He was the most careful thinker she had encountered, careful not in the sense of timid but in the sense of thorough, and she found herself matching her own thinking to his rhythm in a way that felt natural rather than effortful. They did not speak again about the things she had said in the Marshal's office that night, not directly. But something between them had shifted that was not subtle, an awareness that existed in the space between them whenever they were in the same room, a kind of charged attention that was comfortable and uncomfortable in equal measure. She would look up from the statement and find his eyes on her, and he would not look away, and she would not look away, and the moment would last a beat longer than professional necessity required before one of them returned to the document. She was almost ready. She could feel it the way you can feel a change in weather, a pressure that builds to the point where something has to give. The response from the federal office came in the second week of November, and it was largely good news. The Department of Justice confirmed her status as a key witness, outlined the protections available to her, and informed them that Gerald Whitmore had been formally indicted on 12 counts of financial fraud and conspiracy. One of his alleged protectors in high places had apparently decided that his own protection was better served by cooperating with the federal investigation than by maintaining loyalty to Whitmore, and the case had cracked open as a result. She was unlikely to face any prosecution. The department was explicit about this. But even with that written confirmation in hand, she noticed that the relief she felt was incomplete, that there was still a tightness in her that had not released, and she understood it was not about Gerald Whitmore anymore. It was about the accumulated weight of 6 months of fear and silence, and the careful maintenance of distance from anything that might require her to trust. She was in the store on a Wednesday afternoon in late November when the door opened, and Phineas came in, not in the course of his patrol this time, but with the directness of a man who came specifically for something. He stopped at the counter where she was working and placed both hands flat on its surface and looked at her, and she could see that he was not quite at ease, that whatever had brought him here had required a traversal of some internal territory he normally kept private. "I would like to say something," he said. "All right," she said, and set down her pen. "I have not spoken directly to you about the fact that I have feelings for you," he said. "I have been waiting because I thought you needed time, and I did not want to put pressure on a situation that was already complicated. But I am also aware that not saying things can become its own kind of withholding, and I have done enough withholding for this year." He held her gaze. "I care about you considerably, Louisa, more than I have cared about anyone in a very long time. I'm not asking you to respond to that in any particular way. I only wanted it to be said clearly so that you knew it and so that you could factor it into whatever you decide." The store was very quiet around them. She came around the counter and stood in front of him, and she looked up at his face for a long moment, at those dark, careful eyes and the strong jaw and the stillness that she had come to understand was not coldness but choice. And she thought of every Friday evening and every shared evening over her statement and every moment in the past months in which this man had looked at her as though she mattered and stepped back to give her room. She said, "Phineas Abbott." "Yes," he said. "I have been ready for several weeks," she said. "I have been waiting to be certain that I was being honest about it rather than running towards something the way I used to run away from things." Something in his face broke open in the most careful, measured way. "Are you certain now?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He reached out and took her hand, the same hand he had pulled her out of the street with 8 months ago, and he held it in both of his with the same controlled care he used for everything, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the moment did not require it. "I have your father's watch in my pocket," she said. "Keep it," he said. She looked at their joined hands. "Phineas," she said. "Yes, I believe you are the best man I have ever known." He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know that that's true," he said, "but I intend to try to earn it." She smiled. It was the first time in months that her smile arrived without the slight shadow of withheld things behind it, and she felt the difference in her own face. That was the beginning. The real beginning. December came in cold and clear, the plains around Caldwell taking on the spare winter beauty that she had not expected when she arrived from the green and crowded east. All open sky and dry grass, and the long, clean distance that had initially felt like emptiness and now felt like freedom. She and Phineas spent time together in a way that was no longer structured around the formal occasion of Friday supper, but was simply the natural pattern of two people who wanted to be in each other's company. He took her riding one Sunday morning in early December, lending her a steady mare from the livery, and they rode east into the Flint Hills country as the land turned white and silver with frost, and she learned that Phineas Abbott on horseback in open country was a version of himself that was even quieter than his usual self, not withdrawn but expansive, as though the space of the plains released something in him that the confinement of the town kept compressed. He talked, out there. Not in the way most people talked, filling air but purposefully, and she listened to the particular quality of what he said with the attention she had learned to give to the things he chose to share. He told her about Texas, about the years before Caldwell, about the work he had done, and the things it had cost him, and the reason he had come north. He told her about a case that had gone wrong, a young man who had been killed because Phineas had trusted information that turned out to be a trap set by a corrupt official, and the weight of that wrong outcome had never entirely left him. "That is why I verified everything before I brought the federal information to you," he said. "Not because I did not trust you, because I had learned at a significant cost what it means to proceed without being certain of the full picture." She understood then. She understood the hesitation not as concealment, but as the caution of a man who carried a specific scar and had built his practice around not repeating the injury that created it. "I forgive you," she said, "for waiting too long to tell me. I understand it now, but I also need you to know that I am not a case file. I can receive difficult information." "I know that," he said. "I knew that, and you're right that I should have told you sooner." He was quiet for a moment. "I will do better." She looked at him riding beside her in the winter light, the plains extending in all directions around them, and she felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as security, not the false security of circumstances that could change, but the deeper kind that comes from a person being honest with you about their failures. "I will also do better," she said. "I have a tendency towards self-sufficiency that becomes, at a certain point, a way of keeping everyone at arm's length." He glanced at her sideways with the very slight curve at the corner of his mouth that she had come to recognize as his version of a smile. "I had not noticed," he said, and she laughed. It was the first time she had heard herself laugh in months, a real laugh, unguarded, and it rose and dissolved in the cold, bright air of the plains, and she watched it go and felt something in its departure that was like the last of a held breath releasing. They were a couple after that, in the quiet, practical sense that Caldwell used for such things. They did not make announcements or declarations, but they appeared together at the church's holiday supper in mid-December, and Clarence Webb said nothing when Phineas came to walk her home in the evenings, and the residents of the boarding house nodded with the knowing acceptance of people who had watched this development approach from a significant distance. Christmas in Caldwell was modest and genuine. She had no family to spend it with, and his family were gone, and so they spent it together, which felt right in a way that she did not try to analyze because the simplicity of it was part of what made it feel right. He gave her a small volume of poetry that he had ordered from a bookseller in Kansas City, and she gave him a notebook with a good leather cover, because she had noticed he made notes to himself on whatever paper was available, and she thought he deserved a better system. They ate Christmas dinner at the Drovers' Rest with the other boarders and walked home in the snow that had come down quietly in the night, the first real snow of the season, and it lay over everything and made the town look like something from a different story entirely. She reached for his hand while they walked. He closed his fingers around hers without comment, which was exactly right. The new year, 1879, began with news from the federal office that Gerald Whitmore had entered a guilty plea on 7 of the 12 counts against him and was negotiating on the remainder. The plea rendered her testimony unnecessary, at least for the time being, and while she was glad she had written the statement and glad it had gone toward the case, the relief of not having to appear in a courtroom in St. Louis was something she allowed herself to feel fully rather than diminishing it. She told Phineas in the Marshal's office, where she had come to deliver the federal correspondence, and he read the letter with his usual measured attention and set it down and looked at her. "How do you feel?" He asked. "Like it's over," she said, "and like I'm still standing." "You are," he said. "Because of you in part," she said. He shook his head. "You were standing when I found you. You had been managing this alone for months. I only provided some information and some—" He paused, searching. "Some company." "Some company," she repeated. "Is that what you call it?" The corner of his mouth curved. "What would you call it?" She looked at him, this man behind his desk with his Marshal star and his dead father's watch and his dark, careful eyes that gave her everything they had when they were looking at her, and she said, "I would call it the thing that changed everything." In February he asked her to marry him. It was not elaborately staged. They were sitting in the parlor of the boarding house after supper, the only two remaining at that late hour, and the fire was burning down and the room was warm and quiet, and he turned toward her on the settee and said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life with you, if you are willing." She turned toward him. "Phineas Abbott," she said. "Yes." "I have been waiting for you to ask that since approximately December," she said. Something in his face went entirely undone for just a moment, the careful composure dissolving into something that was plainly, openly happy, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. "Then you'll say yes," he said. "I'll say yes," she said. He took her face in his hands with extraordinary gentleness and kissed her for the first time. A slow, careful kiss that was everything she had understood him to be, deliberate and present, and without any of the anxious performance that had characterized every other kiss she could remember. It felt like arriving somewhere she had been traveling toward for a long time without a map. They were married in April of 1879, on a Saturday morning when the Kansas spring had come in with the green ferocity it brought to the Flint Hills, and the church was full of people she had not been certain she would ever allow herself to accumulate. The people of Caldwell who had watched her arrive with nothing and watched her become something. Clarence Webb and his wife Dorothy, who had clucked approvingly since Christmas. The women from the church who had been giving her knowing looks since December. Orville Prout and the other deputy, wearing their best clothes with the self-consciousness of young men, unaccustomed to formal occasions. She wore her best dress, green wool that brought out the color in her eyes, and she carried prairie wildflowers that Dorothy Webb had gathered at dawn, because there was no florist in Caldwell, but there was a woman who knew where the earliest spring flowers grew. When she came through the church door and saw Phineas standing at the front of the church in a dark suit that she had never seen him wear before, standing in his characteristic stillness with his hands quiet at his sides and his eyes on her from the moment she appeared, she felt something lift in her chest that made her breathing unreliable in the most welcome possible way. The minister read the words and they said the words back, and she watched Phineas's face while they said them, and she thought that if the measure of a vow was the sincerity of the person making it, these were the most solid vows she had ever witnessed. He placed on her finger a simple gold band that he had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita, and it was exactly right. After, outside the church in the April sunshine, with Caldwell around them doing the noisy, cheerful thing that towns do when there is something to celebrate, he took both her hands in his and looked at her with that particular expression that she had come to understand meant he was about to say something true. "Louisa," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want you to know that however this looks from the outside," he said, meaning the smallness of it, the plain church and the prairie wildflowers and the town full of people she had known less than a year, "I have never in my life been more certain of anything." She squeezed his hands. "Neither have I," she said, and she meant it from the bottom of everything she was. They lived, to begin with, in a house on the edge of Caldwell that had been vacant since the previous family had moved further west, a frame house with 4 rooms and a porch that faced east and caught the morning light. It was not large, but it was theirs, and she found that the work of making it into something that reflected the people living in it was a pleasure she had not anticipated. She was not a domestic woman in the decorative sense, but she was organized and purposeful, and she understood the relationship between a well-kept space and the quality of rest and renewal it could offer, and she applied herself to the house with the same competence she applied to everything. She continued her work for Clarence Webb and for the town council, and she took on additional bookkeeping for 2 of the cattle operations that needed accounting services during the non-drive season. Phineas had no objection to her working. He had never given any indication that he would, and she found that the absence of that particular obstacle was something she appreciated more than she expected, because she had not fully realized how much of her anxiety about the future had included the question of whether a husband would permit her to keep the work that kept her sane. He was different at home than he was on duty, not fundamentally different, the same man with the same qualities, but softer in the places that the job required hardness. He cooked, which surprised her, not elaborately but with solid competence, and she learned that he had been feeding himself alone for long enough that practical cookery had become a necessity rather than a preference. They cooked together sometimes, and she found that the shared management of something domestic was one of the more unexpectedly intimate pleasures of being married to him. He also talked to her in the evenings in a way that she did not think he talked to anyone else, not the careful informational speech of his professional interactions, but something less structured, his mind following its own paths, and she listened and followed and occasionally redirected, and they ranged across things without agenda. These evenings, she thought, were the real substance of being married to Phineas Abbott, the long unstructured hours in which he was simply himself without the armor of function. She also saw, more clearly with proximity, the toll that his work could take. There were nights when he came home from something difficult with the compressed quiet of a man carrying something he had not yet found the place to set down. And she had learned not to ask directly, but to stay near, to be present in the room, to let him feel her proximity without requiring anything of him. And usually within an hour the compression would begin to ease, and he would come and sit with her, and sometimes talk about it, and sometimes simply allow the talking about it to remain unnecessary. He was a deeply moral man in the complicated rather than the simple sense, meaning he did not operate from rules alone, but from a genuine ongoing engagement with the question of what was right, and this sometimes made his job more difficult because the law and what was right were not always precisely aligned. She thought often of the engraving in the watch she kept always in her pocket now, and had since the night she came to find him. For the one who carries the weight of what is right. His father had seen this in him and named it, and she had the sense that Phineas had spent the years since his father's death trying to be worthy of having been named so accurately. In the summer of 1879, she discovered she was pregnant. She knew before she said anything, sitting with it for a week in the way she sat with important things, letting herself understand it fully before she introduced it to the world. She told Phineas on a Sunday morning when they were on the porch watching the sunrise, sitting in the 2 chairs he had placed there because she liked to watch the morning come, and the plains were golden around them and the air was cool. She said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her. "We are going to have a child," she said. He was still for a moment, then he reached out and took her hand from the arm of her chair and held it and looked out at the morning and then looked back at her, and on his face was the same open happiness she had seen when she said yes to his proposal. The composure dissolved into something that was entirely without guard. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was who he was. "I am entirely well," she said. "I am very glad," he said, and his voice was not quite as steady as usual, and that tiny deviation from his steadiness was more telling than an entire speech from most people. She squeezed his hand. "So am I," she said. The pregnancy was healthy. She continued her work until October and then slowed to a pace that acknowledged the practical demands of her changing body. And Phineas was attentive without being overly cautious, finding the balance between concern and respect for her judgment that she required, and that she had not had to ask for explicitly, because he seemed to understand it as a matter of course. Their son was born in January of 1880, delivered by the doctor Caldwell had acquired in the fall of 1879, a capable woman named Dr. Helen Foster, who had come west from Chicago and who Louisa had liked immediately. The birth was difficult in the way that first births often are, long and exhausting, and Phineas sat outside the room through all of it in the precise quality of stillness that she imagined was not stillness at all on the inside. And when Dr. Foster opened the door and told him he could come in, he crossed the room to the bed where she lay holding a small and indignant new person and sat beside them both with his hands on his knees and looked at the baby and then at her. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am tired and very, very well," she said. He looked at the baby for a long moment. "He looks outraged," he said. "He was very comfortable before," she said. "He'll adjust." The slight curve at the corner of his mouth. Then he reached out one careful hand and touched the baby's fist, which was clenched against the blanket, and the baby's fingers opened and then closed around one of his fingers with the blind, instinctive grip of the newborn. And she watched Phineas Abbott's face at the moment of that small grip, and thought that some things were beyond her ability to put into words, and that she was not going to try. She was simply going to hold the image of his face in that moment and keep it. They named him James, after no one in particular, because it was a name they both liked and that seemed to suit him. James Abbott was a serious baby, which made a certain genetic sense, and then a serious toddler, and he had his father's eyes and his mother's tendency to study everything before proceeding with it, which Phineas observed one afternoon with the very slight smile, and the comment that they had made themselves a person who would always think before acting, which was more than most people could say. She kept her work through James's early years, adjusting the schedule but not abandoning the practice, because the work was part of who she was, and she had the good fortune of a husband who understood this rather than resenting it. Phineas's hours were never entirely predictable, the nature of law enforcement being what it was, and they had developed a practical household arrangement that depended on Dorothy Webb and Dr. Foster as occasional care for James when both parents were occupied, a village-style arrangement that Louisa found she valued far beyond its practical utility. Caldwell grew during those years, not dramatically but steadily, the westward movement that had characterized the decade of the 70s continuing into the 80s, and bringing with it new families, new businesses, new layers of civic life. Phineas had been re-elected Marshal twice by 1881, and he took the continued mandate with the same deliberate competence he took everything, without fanfare, but also without false modesty about the responsibility it carried. In the spring of 1881, a man came to Caldwell looking for Phineas. He arrived on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe on a Wednesday morning, and he was a federal marshal from Kansas City named Harlan Greer, and what he wanted to talk about was a promotion. Phineas told her about it that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with James already asleep, the lamp burning between them and the dark outside the windows full of prairie night. The federal marshal's office had a regional senior position available in Kansas City. The work would be administrative and supervisory rather than direct field work. The compensation was significantly better than his current position. It would require them to leave Caldwell. He set this out plainly, in the way he set out every significant thing, laying the facts in order without editorializing, and then he waited. She looked at the lamp between them and then at him. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want what is right for you and James," he said. "Phineas," she said, "that is not what I asked." The slight pause of a man accustoming himself to answering for himself rather than for others. "I believe I could do the work well," he said, "and I believe it matters, that level of oversight matters for how the law is applied across a wide area, but I am content here. I'm more than content here." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about arriving in Caldwell with 43 cents and a name she didn't trust, and the man across the table from her and the son sleeping in the back room and the pocket watch she had carried for 2.5 years. "Take the position," she said. He looked at her. "The work matters," she said. "You just said so, and you have the ability to do it well. That combination is not something to leave on the table because you are comfortable." She paused. "Besides," she said, "I have been to Kansas City. The bookkeeping opportunities are considerably better." The curve at the corner of his mouth became something fuller, more open than his usual version. "I love you," he said. It was not a phrase he produced frequently or casually, and she had learned to receive it with the weight it carried. "I love you," she said back, and meant it with the full measure of everything she was. They moved to Kansas City in August of 1881, arriving not as a woman running from something with 43 cents, but as a family with a purpose and a destination, and 2 years of furniture packed into a freight car. James, who was 1.5 years old and had opinions about everything, regarded the train journey with great seriousness and then fell deeply asleep before they reached Wichita. Kansas City was larger and louder and more complicated than Caldwell, and she found the adjustment took some time, not the logistics of it but the social texture of it, the need to re-establish herself in a new setting. But she had done this before, from a far more difficult starting position, and she found that the confidence she brought to it now was a different order of magnitude from the careful, frightened competence of the woman who had stepped off the train in Caldwell 3 years before. She established herself quickly. The bookkeeping work came through connections Phineas had in the city, and within 6 months she had a client base that exceeded what she had managed in Caldwell, and by the following year she was managing accounts for 3 substantial businesses and had begun to consider the possibility of a formal accounting practice in her own name. Phineas's work in the federal position was demanding in the way administrative work is demanding when the person doing it cares about it, which is to say that it occupied his mind in the evenings when the day's practical demands were done. He was good at it. She could see that in the way the people around him responded to his leadership, the respect that was grounded in watching him apply consistent principle rather than preference. He missed field work sometimes. She thought, the directness of it, but he did not say this aloud and she did not press, because she understood that a person could hold two true things simultaneously, satisfaction in what they were doing and longing for what they were not, and that the longing did not negate the satisfaction. James turned 3 in January of 1883, a birthday celebrated with a small gathering of the children of the families they had come to know in Kansas City, and he opened his gifts with the methodical focus of a child who intended to understand each thing before moving to the next. Phineas watched him from across the room with an expression that Louisa had come to classify in her private taxonomy as the look of a man who could not quite believe in the reality of his own good fortune, and she went and stood beside him and took his arm. "He has your gravity," she said. "He has your composure," he said. "We have made a very serious child," she said. "We have made a very good one," he said. In the spring of 1883 she discovered she was pregnant again. She told him the same way she had told him the first time, in the morning before the day had begun to demand things of either of them, and his reaction was the same in its quality if not its form, the stillness and then the reaching for her hand and the face that went open and happy. "How do you feel?" he asked first again. "Very well," she said again. "I am glad," he said, and his voice did the same slight thing it had done the first time, the fractional wavering from his usual steadiness, and she tucked it away with the other irreplaceable things. Their daughter was born in October of 1883. They named her Clara, and she was from the first hour of her life a person with strong preferences and no hesitation about expressing them, which differentiated her from both of her parents in a way that made Phineas observe, with the straight face he deployed for dry observations, that they had balanced James's gravity with Clara's animation, and the household would now achieve an equilibrium. She had laughed, lying in the bed with a 3-hour-old person clenched against her shoulder, and he had sat beside her with James on his knee and the quiet happiness that was his version of joy, and she had looked at the four of them in that moment and thought about the woman who had stood on a boardwalk in Caldwell with a pocket watch in her hand and no idea what was coming. "Come find me when you are ready to talk." She had been ready. She had found him. And every day since had been proof that readiness, when you finally achieved it, was not the end of a story but the beginning of one. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, not without difficulty, because life does not operate without difficulty, but full of the substance that makes difficulty bearable and good times worth having. Phineas was promoted again in 1885 to a position that carried greater authority and required him to travel periodically to Washington for meetings with the Department of Justice, and she accompanied him twice on these trips, finding the capital a fascinating and somewhat overwhelming place, more elaborate in its architecture of power than anything she had seen before but not, she decided, more honest than the plains of Kansas, where everything was exactly as visible as it appeared to be. She opened her accounting practice under her own name, Reed and Associates, in 1884, 2 years after she had first considered it, the delay being the practical reality of 2 small children and a household that required management. By 1886, she had 3 associates working with her and a client list that was the largest of any independent accounting firm in Kansas City outside the established old money operations, and she had built it on the same principles that had always governed her work: absolute precision, unconditional honesty, and the protection of her clients' interests against anyone who might be inclined to use financial instruments as weapons. Gerald Whitmore was convicted in 1880 on 9 of the 12 original counts and sentenced to 14 years in a federal prison. She had received the notification from the Department of Justice, with the same quiet internal acknowledgement with which she received most significant things, sitting with it for a day before she told Phineas. His response had been to hold her for a long moment without speaking, and she had let herself be held, and that had been the right resolution of a thing she had carried for a very long time. She was not the woman who had run from St. Louis anymore. She was not defined by what had been done to her there. But she also had not forgotten it, and she had built her practice in part on the knowledge of what financial manipulation looked like from the inside. And more than once she had caught a client's money being moved by an unscrupulous party and had stopped it before the damage became irreversible. And in those moments, she thought about the auditor who had arrived too late and about the woman who had signed papers she had not been allowed to read. And she was glad that her particular history had made her the kind of person who knew where to look. James, at 7, began to show an interest in reading that rivaled both his parents. He worked through the books in their home library systematically, asking questions about what he did not understand with a directness that was entirely his father's. And Phineas answered every question with the same seriousness with which it was asked, which Louisa observed from across the room, sometimes with a private warmth that was one of the specific pleasures of watching a person you loved be good at something you valued. Clara, at 4, was interested in everything and committed to nothing for more than 20 minutes, and she moved through the house in a state of continuous discovery that kept her parents in a permanent mild state of alert. She had her mother's coloring and her father's eyes, and she was, Louisa thought, entirely herself, not a composite of either of them but something new, which was perhaps the most accurate description of what children were. In the summer of 1887, they went back to Caldwell. Phineas had business in the region, and it made sense to go together, and she found herself standing on 2nd Street on a July morning, watching the town that had grown and changed in the years since she had left it, and feeling the strange double vision of a person who sees a place both as it is and as it was. The general store was still there, though Clarence Webb had sold it to a younger man in 1885 after his health declined. Dorothy Webb was still in town, retired now, and she received them with a warmth that was entirely Dorothy, pressing them both to her ample chest and exclaiming over James and Clara as though the years had not happened, but also as though they had, with the rich layered affection of someone who had watched a significant portion of their story from close range. She walked alone one afternoon to the Marshal's office, which was occupied now by a different man, a young Marshal with a bright face who welcomed her politely, and seemed unsurprised to have the wife of a senior federal official come through his door. She stood in the room for a moment, looking at the desk where Phineas had sat, the chair across from it where she had sat on a night in October 1878, and the floor between them across which the conversation that changed everything had traveled. She reached into her pocket and touched the pocket watch, cool silver under her fingers, and she thought about time and what it did and did not do, and what it meant that almost 9 years after a man had pressed this into her hand and turned and walked away, she was standing in the room where the most important conversation of her life had taken place, in a body that was entirely changed by everything that had come after, carrying the same watch in the same pocket. She thought, this is what is meant by a life. Not the absence of fear or loss, or the dark patches of things done wrong, and things done to you. But this, the persistence through all of it, and the person beside you while you persist, and the accumulation of days that add up to something you could not have imagined at the beginning. She walked back to the boarding house where they were staying, and Phineas was on the porch with the children when she came up the street, James reading on the top step, and Clara conducting some elaborate investigation of a beetle she had found in the garden, and Phineas watching both of them with the vigilant attention that was his version of ease. He looked up when she came through the gate, and she saw his eyes go to her face in the way they had always gone to her face, looking for what was there. "All right," he said. "Better than all right," she said. She went up the porch steps and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her without ceremony, the naturalness of long intimacy, and she leaned against his shoulder and watched Clara continue the beetle investigation and James turn a page without looking up. She reached into her pocket and took out the watch and held it in her palm. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" he said. "About the night you gave me this," she said. She felt him look down at the watch in her palm. "What about it?" he said. "I was so afraid," she said. "Of you, of what you knew about me, of what it might mean, of everything. And I was standing on that boardwalk thinking that I could not bear one more thing that turned out to be different from what it appeared." "I know," he said. "But I came," she said. "I was afraid and I came anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You always do." She turned the watch in her hand. The October light of that afternoon seemed very distant now, replaced by July warmth and the sounds of 2 children, and the solid reality of a life that had been built out of the courage it had taken to walk toward something rather than away from it. "I think your father was right," she said. "About what?" he said. "About the weight of what is right," she said. "I think he knew when he wrote that carrying it is hard, but that it is also the thing that makes a person who they are. The carrying of it." Phineas was quiet for a long moment. Then he put his hand over hers, over the watch, and held it there. "He would have loved you," he said. She closed her fingers around the watch and around his hand. "I think I would have loved him too," she said. Clara looked up from the beetle. "Mama," she said, with the accusatory directness of a 4-year-old who had made a discovery, "this beetle has 6 legs and it is very interesting." "I believe you," Louisa said. "Come and look," Clara said. She glanced at Phineas, who had the slight curve at the corner of his mouth. She got up and went down the porch steps to crouch beside her daughter in the garden, and she looked at the beetle, which was indeed a very fine one, and she heard James get up from the step and come to look too, and she heard Phineas follow, and they were all 4 of them crouched in the garden of a boarding house in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1887, examining a beetle in the grass. And she thought that the specific character of happiness was that it was so often not grand. That it was so often exactly this, something small and immediate and full of the people you loved. The years continued. James grew into a thoughtful, serious young man who, at 13, announced that he intended to study law, a declaration that Phineas received with a composure that Louisa suspected concealed considerable private satisfaction. Clara grew into a child of relentless curiosity, who by 8 was dismantling everything in the house to understand how it worked, and by 12 had a theoretical understanding of mechanical principles that exceeded most adults she encountered. Phineas left the federal position in 1890, not because he had failed it, but because he had taken it as far as his interest in administrative work could take him, and because both he and Louisa had begun to talk about what came next with the candor they applied to everything important. He was 41, she was 38, and James was 11 and Clara was 7, and the question of how to live was not the desperate, urgent question it had been, but the considered and expansive one that is asked by people who have the good fortune to choose. They stayed in Kansas City. He joined a law firm as an investigator and consultant, work that used his knowledge of the federal system and his judgment in ways that were satisfying without the relentlessness of full-time law enforcement. She continued Reed and Associates, which by 1890 was the largest independent accounting firm in the city and employed 7 people, and she took on work that she found genuinely interesting, including the accounts of several organizations working toward civic reform, which felt like the fullest expression of everything she had learned about the relationship between money and power and who got to hold which. On an evening in the spring of 1892, they sat on the porch of their Kansas City house, which was a good deal larger than the 4-room frame house in Caldwell, but which she thought of with the same quality of belonging. And the evening light was coming in long and gold across the garden, and the sounds of the city were present but distant. And James was somewhere inside doing his studies, and Clara was at a friend's house and would be home by dark. She had the watch in her hand. She had taken to looking at it sometimes in the evenings, not to check the time, because she had a mantel clock for that, but simply to hold it, to feel the warm silver of it and the tick of it against her palm. "I was thinking today," she said, "about a woman standing on a boardwalk in Caldwell with this watch in her hand and no idea what to do next." Phineas, sitting beside her, turned his head slightly to look at her. "I barely recognize her," she said. "Not because she was weak. I don't think she was weak. I think she was exhausted and frightened and doing the best she could, but she was so alone." "She did not stay alone," he said. "No," she said. She turned the watch in her hand. "You know what I have thought about sometimes." "Tell me," he said. "I have thought about how differently it could have gone," she said, "if I had not come to find you that night. If I had decided that the fear was too great, that the risk was too much. If I had stayed in that boarding house room with the watch on the table and never come to the door of the Marshal's office." He was quiet for a moment. "I would have come to find you," he said. "Eventually," she smiled. "Would you?" "Yes," he said. "I was giving you time. I had not given up." "That is very like you," she said. "You had not given me any indication that the situation was hopeless," he said. "Only that it was not yet ready." She turned to look at him fully. This man who had been at her side for 14 years and who was still, in some essential way, that time and familiarity had not diminished but only deepened. The most interesting person she had ever encountered. The dark eyes were the same, perhaps a little more lined at the corners, and the jaw carried more gray than it had, and the stillness was the same, the quality of it perhaps settled further in, as though it had been confirmed by the years rather than just his nature. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said, and the phrase had accumulated 14 years of meaning, and it held all of it. She held the watch out toward him. He looked at it and then at her. "I think," she said, "that it is time for this to go back to you. You have given it to me twice and I have kept it long enough. It was your father's." He looked at her for a long moment, then he shook his head. "My father gave it to me because he saw something in me," he said. "When I gave it to you it was for the same reason. It belongs where it has always belonged." She closed her fingers around it. "With the one who carries the weight of what is right." "Yes," he said. The evening light moved across the garden and the tick of the watch kept its steady count. And she thought about time, about what it carried and what it left behind, and what it made possible. And she thought about the particular mercy of having found the right person to carry the weight alongside, not because the weight became lighter with company, but because the carrying of it became something other than solitude. Inside the house she heard the front door open and Clara's voice calling from the entrance. Home early. She had news apparently. There was a matter of tremendous importance concerning the school science fair, and a project involving a steam-powered mechanism that Mrs. Henley had declared inadvisable but which Clara considered both feasible and essential. Phineas caught her eye and the corner of his mouth curved in the full version of his smile. "Ready?" he said. She stood and tucked the watch into her pocket and looked at the evening light on the garden for one more moment. "I have been ready," she said, "for 14 years." She opened the door and went in to hear about the steam mechanism, and Phineas followed her in from the evening, and the door closed behind them both on the kind of evening that would not be remembered in any particular history but would be held, the way all such evenings are held, in the bodies of the people who lived it, in the accumulated warmth of a life that had been worth the building. The pocket watch ticked on in her pocket, steady as a heart, keeping the time of everything that mattered.